Welcome to Excel in Case Interviews. This is an overview of the case interview. Many of you will begin the process, or perhaps have already begun the process, of learning about the case interview, whether you're looking at management consulting roles or roles in the corporate environment or data science. What we want to do with this introduction is just lay out the experience of the case interview, the expectations, and some of the preliminary foundations that are going to guide your preparation. As a bit of a welcome, my name is Pam Schilling. I'm going to be talking you through this introduction, and I am the CEO of Archer Career, and I've spent the last decade developing expertise around career strategies focused on job searches and career advancement. And the focus of Archer Career is really to help people get hired and help them advance, particularly within some of the most selective organizations. I have an educational background dominantly in business, and that's where a lot of my fundamentals come from. And then I've also had some opportunities to teach over the years, so thinking about how strategy and accounting and finance are taught. The other thing that I bring to this discussion and all of the training and work that we do at Archer Career is having been in the roles that many of you are seeking, as well as being a hiring manager in many of those roles. I myself got an MBA at the University of Chicago. I recruited for strategy consulting. I went to my top choice firm. And then two other times, I also recruited for consulting roles as an experienced hire candidate. And at each of those three firms, I was a part of the campus recruiting teams as well as training and onboarding our new consultants and experienced hires. So there's a lot of things that I think I may look at just a little bit differently because of the diversity of my experience, having worked at a number of firms and as well being a part of the educational process in teaching many of the theories and frameworks that are so necessary to apply to consulting. As we approach this and you think about your case interview training, there are two goals that I think are very important and they must work together. So, one is obviously to be prepared for the interview. The other side is to be confident, and that plays a main role in securing your ultimate job offer. When you think about the journey that you're about to embark on or continue on if you've already started it, there are many things that are necessary that go into the case interview. It's very much like a capstone exam. The first thing is to get your foundations ready and solid. Then you want to build your skills and start to really focus on the things that are necessary for the case interview itself, and do that by way of a number of different areas of analysis and drilling and thinking. And then finally, being able to connect those case elements together. All of those steps take you up to that place where you are interview ready. And if you've done the right type of practice, that's where your confidence comes from. By the way, this is not about becoming an interview robot. More and more organizations are using case problems in their interviews. It's not just consulting firms anymore. But those consulting firms have even started to think more deeply about how to differentiate candidates. And some of the things that we're going to talk about will help focus on that. Three things that this introduction is going to cover. One, just an overview of the case interview to refresh and ground us. Secondly, a couple of the core elements about solving a case in an interview setting. And then number three, some of the foundations, the training, the focus areas that are necessary that will help you get to that top point where you're ready to solve the case in an interview setting. Let's talk a little bit then about what the case interview is, and I want to do this from the perspective of the interviewer. Many of you know, you've probably heard from classmates or read online, looked at the consulting firm's websites, that the case interview is solving a question about a real business situation. Many times these are either problems that a consultant or a business professional has faced in their day to day work. It could be a little bit stylized for the format of the interview, but it is something that is probably gone on in the attention span of your interviewer. Many times you have about 45 minutes, maybe even a little bit less, to focus on this problem. You typically don't have a lot of resources in front of you other than a pen and maybe a sheet of notes. And the intention is that it's going to simulate some aspect of the job that you're going to go to. Now, by no means is the case interview perfect, but it is a simulated problem solving activity. It benefits those that are quick thinkers, that are structured, that are able to do math in a very rapid way, but also those who can think very conceptually, think through the ambiguity, think about creative ways to look at problems. So there's plenty of room, depending on your skill set, to build some of the areas that maybe you aren't as strong and be successful in the long run. A couple of examples that we'll be talking about throughout this discussion and any further training that you might participate in. A few case examples that we'll be talking about in not only this discussion, but any future training that you may participate in with us. The first case scenario is the spice division of a major food manufacturer. They've had flat or declining sales and profitability over the last 5 years. That client would like to know what they should do to improve the performance of the business. A second example, you have a friend who is a business person but wants to become an entrepreneur. They found a hot dog stand in the downtown area of your city. It's often very busy, it has a long line, and your friend is thinking about buying it. How would you help evaluate this decision? What might be the maximum price that you're willing to pay? A third scenario, you're advising the new dean of the Graduate School of Business, perhaps a school that you might be attending. What would you highlight as some of the key issues and challenges, and how would you recommend that the dean handle those? Now, there are clearly more and more options out there, but these are just a couple of examples, and you'll see those again in some of our follow-on discussions. So back to the perspective of the interviewer. We're sitting together in an interview room or perhaps in a virtual environment, and I'm going to give you the case prompt, you're going to solve it, and then I'm going to be assessing a few things about the work that you've done. The focus of that assessment really involves a couple of things. So, one, at a fundamental level, I'm looking at your problem solving skills. I want to understand how you think, how you prioritize, how you analyze, and can you structure a problem in a way that makes sense, which is really the roadmap of how you're going to do your work. Throughout, you're going to be demonstrating this balance between creativity and pragmatism. So I want to see some interesting ideas, but I also want to know that there's a view of feasibility in terms of how the interviewer is presenting those options. And is it clear that they fit within the confines and the constraints and the capabilities of the client that you've been discovering during your interview? All of that allows you to communicate your thinking, your rationale, and to try to influence around your ideas. So that piece is very important as well. And again, this is for a real business problem. Something to keep in mind, there's not always a specific right answer. Yes, it is true that some cases are leading you down a path, but other cases have many alternatives. Don't assume that cases have a one way approach in the way that you end the case or what you're striving towards. It really just depends on the way that the interviewer has crafted their case. In addition, there is a phrase, always be structured. There's something called the pyramid principle that is a way of communication that describes what your thinking is and then your rationale. That's a structured way to think, and that's very beneficial in the case interview. And just a final comment, the interviewer is not looking for you to, quote, crack the case. That means that you're taking some type of an exam. I have a solution. I'm trying to fit you into that solution and see that you got there. Most of the time, the case interview is really looking at the approach that you use. How do you think? I want to understand what goes on inside your mind and coming up with some ideas that are creative, just as you would as a consultant. That's one of the most important things I think that you have to remember when trying to approach a case interview problem. The faster you try to get through it, the more you try to be smooth in the way that you solve the problem, the more that you approach it as if it's putting your head down and trying to come up with the answer. That's less realistic in the way that we solve problems in an actual consulting environment or a business environment. So try to treat this very much like you're solving a real client problem. What this means is that you're demonstrating throughout this whole case interview a number of things. As a business person, you're going to demonstrate theory. Now, your degree of demonstration of that may depend on your background, may depend on how long you've been in your academic program, whether it's an internship or full time, whether you're an undergraduate, an MBA, a master's, a PhD. Your grasp of theory is going to be a little bit different, but it is good to do some preparation around business acumen and making sure you have some of the core fundamentals. There's also an integration of your real world knowledge. All of us are consumers. We see things, we read things, we may have experienced things. We may understand different cultures and different aspects to life that represent certain demographics. Bringing a bit of that to the forefront can be beneficial, just again to give kind of that deeper level insight. Also, the analytics are critical. Most cases have some type of analysis. More often than not, it's a quantitative analysis, but there are certainly elements of cases that can be more of a qualitative analysis, but you've got to think that way. And then I mentioned a little bit already about that balance between pragmatism and creativity. By doing these things, you show the real experience that we're having. This isn't an exam. You're showing that you're structured, you're presenting your logic, which is the rationale and how you're thinking. And all of that leads to you being confident in the way that you're approaching the problem, you're thinking about the problem, and the conclusions that you get to. The interviewer is well aware that you only have perhaps 30, 35 minutes to think through a very broad business problem at times. So it's not about trying to dot every I and cross every T and turn over every rock. It's much more about, can you put stakes in the ground given the information that's been presented to you and connect the dots and then do so with confidence. If you've had the chance to see a video about a case interview, that's wonderful. And if you've not yet, I encourage you to do so. Many of the consulting firms have them on their websites. You can find it on YouTube, and then also we will have some examples for you. But in general, a case interview that's a full case interview will flow in a typical fashion. So one is you'll be greeted by your interviewer, could be at your campus, could be in their office, could be again in a virtual environment. There will be some type of introduction. You may be asked a couple of non-case questions first, could be a resume walkthrough, could be a fit question. And then the interviewer is going to move to the case. They're going to give you the prompt or the background of the case. They may give you a lot of details. They may give you very few details. They may give you some information. They may give you none and require you to ask it. So be prepared for any of those. And then you're very much going to take over the solving of the case. Now, the working stage, it could be that the case is being a bit facilitated by the interviewer. You still have to work the case and be proactive in your thinking. It also could be that you're completely working the case. That's more of a self-directed case, and then you'll constantly be having to map out the case path. At times, you're going to ask questions of the interviewer, but when you're done, you may have 10 minutes at the end to be able to ask the interviewer some questions. It can be nice to ask the interviewer if this was a case that they had worked on with one of their clients. If so, what maybe was some of the direction. It's a chance to have a little bit of dialogue about the work that you did. And then you'll have a wrap up at the end, and ideally the interviewer will give you some sense of what the next steps are. Many times consulting interviews have a rapid conclusion. The response that you get for a next round or an offer can come between 1 and 2 days. If it's on a Friday, probably by Monday you'll hear. Certainly that's not 100% of the time, but generally this process moves fairly quickly. An additional area that you want to begin to explore, and you don't necessarily have to do this up front, but there's certainly benefit to having an awareness. By the end of your preparation, you definitely want to know this and be prepared for it. There are different delivery styles of cases. So some cases can be self-directed, where you as the candidate kind of move the case from point A to point Z, choosing which destinations you want to stop at in between. There's also a style of a case called interviewer-led, where the interviewer prompts you a little bit, gives you some guidance of the area of analysis to focus on. You're still going to have to direct the case in terms of explaining where you would head next or why you're thinking a certain way or prioritizing, but the interviewer is marching you through the case path. There could also be a written case where you receive a handout in advance. There are team cases when you're working in a group. And then there are also some versions of cases that are a little bit more expedited or condensed, a mini case or a scenario. Knowing these is beneficial, and different firms tend to have one style or the other, or the first round versus the second round has a particular style. As you begin, this won't be as critical, but as you move through the process and you get to that final stage of preparation, you're going to want to know what that firm's interview style is. All right, so now that we have a little bit of that overview, I want to talk about a couple of the elements to actually solving the case, just getting inside of it a little bit and where some of your attention ought to be, particularly at this stage. So overall, when you're thinking about solving a case, it generally moves through three pieces. And yes, there are varying ways to think about this, but as someone who's solved client problems, as someone who's taught using the case interview method, honed at the Harvard Business School, and researched really some of the best practices for those who, over the years, I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of students who've secured offers. I tend to say go for a simple approach. And of course, if you want to think about some things as you get more mastered at the case, by all means do so. But at the start, let's just keep it in three simple pieces. So, the very beginning of solving a case is the case start. Dominantly, that involves developing your hypotheses and structuring the problem, structuring the approach that you're going to use. Then you'll move into the solving stage, which is where you get a chance to do some of the analysis and collect additional information. And then once you have done all the relevant solving, then you have the chance to conclude. And that's really your closing argument. Being able to work your way through all those pieces is beneficial, and it will be assessed by your interviewer. To break that flow down just a little bit more specifically, so if we start from top to bottom, in step one, that's where your interviewer is going to give you the background of the case. Then step two, you generally should ask a couple of questions at the start of the case. And one of the things to really pay attention to is what kind of questions that you should be asking. As you're learning more and more about case interviews, pay attention to that. Get some feedback. Try not to get too much into the weeds at the very early state of the case, and really ask a couple of targeted questions to help you get grounded. The third step then is the hypothesis and thinking about the structure. Those two things are very interconnected, and probably this is one of the most important parts of the case in general. This is your ideas. This is how you're going to create some of the drivers that influence the decisions or the recommendations. And ultimately, it's the approach that you've taken to organize the various facets of analysis that you're going to do. Then you move into step four, which is taking each of those areas of analysis, I call them branches, and analyzing them in a focused way. So this is where you have a chance to apply some of the business acumen, ask a few more questions, get data, analyze it, synthesize it, and then connect it back to the overall case question. Each area of the case you're going to do that for until you've worked through the most important areas. And that's when you will be able to put your head up and step back and provide the final conclusion for the case, which likely has some recommendations and considerations that the client would want to think about. So one of the hardest things about the case interview is really getting settled up front. And some of you may be thinking this where, I'm in 2 minutes into the case, I've been given this kind of big, gnarly problem, don't have a lot of data, where do I even go from there? This is what a lot of your practice is going to be wrapped around. And one of the best things to do as an early skill building is to think about the type of situation that you're facing when you're given a case prompt. When you take that question that's asked of you, What does it focus on? What does it demand that you pay attention to and that you answer at the end of the case? So, generally, the case prompts and the question that you're focused on fall into four categories: analysis, evaluation, the problem, and decisions. Let's break those down just a little bit further. So, analysis is fairly straightforward. If you're given a question like, what's going to be the return on investment of the project? What's the market size? That's some type of analysis. It requires you to do a calculation. Now, analysis could be integrated throughout many, many parts of the case, but some cases will be purely analytic. You have to listen for that. The second type of case question we call evaluation. Fundamentally, what that means is that you're going to look at both sides of an issue, or pros and cons. That's very important to understand because you've got to do some good analysis to get to that evaluation. It could be qualitative, it could be quantitative. So, a couple of example questions. Do you agree with the UK's decision to leave the EU? Or what do you think about the return policy of a given retailer? That could be the focus of the case. It could also be one aspect of the case. So that's something to keep in mind. So that area is an evaluation. The third area then is evaluating even more a specific problem, largely around a causation or a root cause, or some type of criteria to evaluate an opportunity. Often, the way that you trigger that there's some type of problem that you need to focus on to draw a particular conclusion is that there's a why question or a how question. It's a very specific. So you might have a new sales strategy and the manager's concerned because it's not getting traction. It could be that you launched a marketing campaign and it had a low response rate. The question would be why? Why did those things happen? And then once you know that, you can make some choices going forward. Could be some of your recommendations to turn that problem around. The fourth area then is a decision. This is where you have to give a very specific answer. Yes or no, where, which one, how should we do something? Decision is any type of recommendation or putting a very specific action plan in place to go forward. A couple of examples of that might be, should this company launch a new product? Obviously, yes or no are the choices. Another example might be, what should be done to improve the market share? You'd want to have some very clear and specific ways that market share could be improved. These feed into your hypotheses. They also feed into your structure. At the early stage of the case, the better that you can be about diagnosing the question that's been asked and what situation does it fit into, the better off you're going to be. What you also have to be aware of is that the situations are not mutually exclusive. We can have two of them within the same case. As an example, the company has declining profitability. Why? And what would you do to recommend addressing this issue? So it's both a problem, which is diagnosing the root cause, and a decision, which is coming up with recommendations. So keep that in mind that you may not just be evaluating one particular situation. Let's just walk through a couple of these as an example, a bit of an activity. If you like, pause the video, think through this, start then back up, and then see if your thinking matches the situation that I've identified. So back to some of our example cases. The spice division of a major food manufacturer has had flat or declining sales and profits over the last 5 years. Why? That would be a problem because we've got to identify the root cause. If instead the question was phrased, should the company acquire the major competitor of the spice division, that might be more of an evaluation, and it could lead to a decision. The should the company acquire lends itself to a yes or no question. In the second scenario, then, your friend that's thinking about buying the hot dog stand. The first question is, what do you think of that idea? That might require an evaluation. You'd want the pros and the cons. If you're asked what would be the maximum price he should pay for the business, that might be a calculation which fits under the category of an analysis. You're going to do some type of valuation. The third question then, with the dean, what would you highlight as the key issues and challenges, and how would you handle them? That's a pretty broad question, but it sounds an awful lot like an evaluation and then a decision. So the evaluation here would be to go through and perhaps talk about the strengths of the school, perhaps the gap areas, then to prioritize those, and then to think about what should be done going forward. That's actually a pretty complicated question if you think about it. All right, so that foundation gives you a little bit of a sense of the first couple of minutes of the case. Over time, that business situation is going to be coming to you very quickly, and you're going to be able to rapidly identify that. The next section, I just want to spend a couple of minutes then on building the knowledge base that's beneficial for cases and pick out a couple of important areas that at this stage are very relevant and would be worthy of some of your attention. The first is back to those business issues. So we mapped out the 4 different types of questions. Many times, though, a case is wrapped around a particular problem type in business. Rather than trying to think about every potential scenario, I've grouped these into categories. So some of the business issues relate to profitability, either declining or they'd like to grow profitability. There's another area that we'll call market study, and this has to do with entering a new market, driving revenue growth, getting market share, dealing with a competitor response. The third area might be M&A, potentially a joint venture. There's some very particular techniques and ways of thinking about that. The fourth area then could be an investment. This is where we want to put some capital behind a decision and have some type of new business activity, some new asset that we're going to build, some new capacity or capability. The fifth then is an internal evaluation. This has to do with the activities of our different functional areas. Could be marketing, could be service, could be our culture, could be change, could be sales. There's a lot of different things that fall into that. The next area is a bit more specialized, but these cases certainly come up and with great frequency around private equity, venture capital, startup businesses. And having some of the lexicon, some of the frameworks in mind can help you quite a lot. And then by the same definition, the last area has to do with nonprofits, NGOs, the public sector. There are different motivations, there are some slightly different considerations, so it's worth studying. You will also have some areas, either a full case or a piece of a case that deals with particular math or quantitative aspects like market sizing or other types of math problems. And then occasionally, although this is certainly used to a much lesser extent in the present environment, there can be brain teasers or other ways to think about estimating things, the weight of a 747, how many M&Ms fit in a particular type of jar, those sorts of things. I would really do your due diligence to find out in that last category if that's going to be relevant for your interview process. In the same spirit, there's also a number of areas of business acumen that you want to be developing based on, again, your profile, what level you're at, what the role is that you're going to be looking at. But some areas to drive your focus. One has to do with accounting. Now, no one here is being trained to be an accountant, that's for sure. But a lot of the metrics for evaluating business performance come out of the accounting domain. And so looking at things like a balanced scorecard, the break-even equation, how to evaluate financial statements, financial drivers, and then certain key ratios. I've listed a few here that are the dominant ones: gross margin, net profit margin, return on assets, return on equity, return on investment. Knowing how to calculate those, that's a definite absolute essential. The second area then is economics, knowing some of the key elements of micro for supply demand and perhaps price elasticity, how sensitive prices are for a given consumer group. And then also macroeconomics, some of the factors, the external factors which drive the macroeconomic environment, as well as the construction of GDP growth rates, that sort of thing. The third area then is finance. Again, you will not be expected to be financial experts. And for the most part, the financial calculations will be straightforward because you don't have access to a calculator. Knowing the principles behind evaluation, what's the difference between cash and profit, what is free cash flow, how to calculate a terminal value, and then some of the calculations behind M&A, particularly synergies, benefits from merger integration, that sort of thing. The next area then is marketing. Surprisingly, for many of us, marketing comes up over and over and over again in the case interview outside of marketing focused roles. That's something that I think often surprises people, but there are so many interesting and challenging business issues that revolve around marketing. I think that's why that's the case. But really understanding market segmentation, how to profile customers, also the determinants of market share, and then, of course, the marketing mix, which is the four P's. But there's more to marketing than just the four P's, so pay attention to that. There's also some areas of operations, supply chain, and process analysis. And then, for sure, one of the larger areas is strategy. So, thinking about product market growth, thinking about things like value chains and the pestle analysis, Porter's Five Forces, the 7S framework for change management, and then value chain analysis. Those are different tools, different ways of analytically evaluating and setting direction for strategy. So, being familiar with as many of those tools, not just being able to memorize them, but really being able to apply them, can be beneficial as you're progressing your case and again trying to get that state of receiving an offer. With that, just a couple of concluding comments, and we'll come to the close with an introduction. There's a few best practices when it comes to solving a case. The first really comes down to being extremely clear about what your focus is for the case. What is it that you're trying to answer? Asking high impact questions throughout the whole case, really trying to get at the things that are deeper level insights. The second area then is your structure, making sure that it's MECE, making sure that it's tailored to that case and to that business, and that you stay structured no matter what it is that you happen to be looking at. The third area is your approach to solving. A couple main things stand out here. One is using a hypothesis to guide you. The second is being able to prioritize among a lot of different potential issues or ideas. And then third, sometimes the most creative ideas are the most simple. It's a case interview, it's in a constrained environment. I'm causing you to think on your feet. Be straightforward. Really attack the heart of the matter that you're focused on. You will also have to give a conclusion. The conclusion is your final 2-3 minutes of the case. Make it good, make it strong, make it practical, make it an executive summary. Those will matter to the interviewer. And then overall, trying to think about your interaction with the person that you're meeting with. This isn't an exam, I've said that before. It's almost like talking to a client, but also talking to a coworker. Just think how that interaction is going to go and should go. And make sure that the type of things that sometimes you would keep inside your head and think about, they actually get articulated verbally to the other person. That's one of the main things that the interviewer wants to know, is the rationale behind your thinking. They want to see the process while it's happening. Thank you very much for taking a few minutes to listen to this introduction about the case interview. and we hope we see you sometime soon at our next case interview training called Excel in Case Interviews.